Good evening and welcome to UCSD Conversations. I'm Mary Walshock, Associate Vice Chancellor for Public Programs at the University of California, San Diego. It is my pleasure to introduce you to some of our faculty and their cutting-edge research. Please join us for an enlightening evening of conversation. Tonight we'll take a look at UCSD students who are bringing the arts into public schools and have an update from the Tuschinski Lab in the Department of Neuroscience. But first, historian Paul Pickowitz and sociologist Richard Madsen with some surprising evidence of the Western influence on pop culture in China. They're with historian and guest host Michael Parrish. Michael?
Thank you, Mary. I'm Michael Parrish from the Department of History at UC San Diego, and I'm substituting this evening for your regular host, Patrick Ledden. My guests this evening are Professor Paul Pickowitz from the Department of History at UCSD and Chinese Studies, and Professor Richard Madsen from the Department of Sociology at UCSD. And along with Perry Link, they are the editors and authors of a new book entitled Popular China: Unofficial Culture in a Globalizing Society. Welcome to UCSD Conversations, both of you.
Thank you very much.
I'd like to begin by noting that several weeks ago, President Bush made a visit to China where he had high-level talks with the current paramount leader. And I want to ask you, Paul, did President Bush see any of the China that you and Professor Madsen discuss in this new book?
Well, I think the short answer is no, because if you look through this volume, you'll see chapters on gay sexuality, you'll see chapters on begging, the culture of begging, you'll see chapters on official corruption and popular responses to it, you'll see chapters on domestic violence, and so forth. All of these are things we put into the category of popular China. These are not the things the president saw, was likely to be able to see, even if he wanted to see them. But I think there are other reasons why he didn't see them. Namely, one would expect the President of the United States to be talking to high-level leaders in China about state-to-state relations and what the Chinese call, dashi, big affairs of the world. In other words, they focus at the elite level. And that's true of a lot of scholars as well. People who study history and politics and society of China look at elite developments, policy changes, and so on. For years now, we have been trying to focus in a different kind of area. We've tried to look at how the Chinese world looks from the bottom up as opposed to how it looks from the top down. And so, we do our field research out in the streets, in the villages, talking to all sorts of different people in society to try to find out what is going on in daily life and how change is being recorded in that realm. And so, we think that's part of the story that's not known about China. Even tourists who go to China don't really get a chance to probe into the areas that we look at in the book because, frankly, it's difficult. You have to put in a lot of time making contact with ordinary people, talking to them about their lives, trying to mine very, very unusual sources of information, not the sort of thing that we think of political scientists and government analysts looking at over the years.
But both you and Dick in the book suggest that this other side of China, even though it's not at the top elite level, is going to have a profound impact ultimately on those state-to-state relationships as China goes through this process of globalization. So what's happening on the ground is ultimately going to affect, is that not true, what happens in terms of state-to-state relations?
It's absolutely correct. It's going to have an enormous impact. The problem, of course, is that when you talk about popular China, you talk about 1 billion people who are in a tremendous number of diverse situations. And so if you talk about the elites, you have a fixed number of people you can talk to and you can figure out what they say. Even that's not that easy. But if you look at ordinary people, there's so many different people with so many different situations, so many different interests, so many different approaches, so many different ways of finding meaning in this process of modernization. And they each are reacting to it in different ways. So you get a kaleidoscope of communities and people with all their varied reactions. And obviously this is going to add up to something very important, but because it's so diverse, it's difficult to know what the bottom line someday is going to be.
I'd like each of you to talk a little bit about your specific contributions to the volume. Paul, you have an essay in here about violence and women, especially in the countryside, in the rural areas of China, Would you tell us a little bit about whether this is new or whether this is a continuing problem that China has had?
Well, I think it's safe to assume that the problem of domestic violence is an old one in China as it is everywhere else in the world. Nothing strange about that. But the conditions under which it flourishes now, I think, are a little bit different. I was shocked a while ago to learn that China had the highest rate of suicide in the world, and it turns out to be primarily among women. The majority of the suicides in China are committed by women, and that's unusual by world standards. And even more unusual is the suicides that take place most of them anyway, are set in the rural sector, not in the urban sector. And we normally think of that as an urban phenomenon in the Western world. 500 Chinese women kill themselves a day, and almost all of them are rural dwellers. And when I heard those numbers, I thought that, well, what's going on? We need to understand that a lot better. And we don't know very much about the contours of domestic violence in rural China or even in urban China, over the decades and over the centuries. But when I went to China to do field research in a couple of villages, one in central China, one in North China, it became clear that the circumstances have shifted. And I think what we're trying to show in this book is that when the Communist Party gave up, in effect, on communism, gave up on collective life, gave up on socialism as a way to organize the rural economy, what they set loose were forces of mobility. That is to say, people were lashed to the land under the collective. They couldn't leave. They worked, men and women alike, worked side by side in many cases, in the collective, in the communes, for decades. And when the party did away with that system, they allowed people to become entrepreneurial. It was now okay to get rich. It was okay to get rich by your own wits. And this required mobility, leaving the land and going and finding opportunities wherever they resided. And the pattern in rural China with the end of the collective is that the men typically left the rural collective and went off to find construction and other kinds of jobs, became part of this floating population that there's so much discussion of now, and the women tended to stay behind, take care of the children, take care of the elderly, who in almost every case were the parents of the husband. And so she's back there in the old collective, now working a piece of land and taking care of children and elders. And in many cases, what we found in interviews and in published sources in China, that men who did well tended not to want to go back to the old ways, and they found new relationships and new partners in the urban sector, started new families and so forth, and this led to extreme tension in the institution of marriage and resulted in violent confrontations, even suicide. On the other hand, with the men outside the village, another thing that happened is that the women left back in the village, and that's what they were called, women left behind, then became the prey of local toughs, basically men who were preying on them. And the problem is, among many problems, that there's not much of a legal system in China, and so there wasn't much recourse for women, and they suffered these abuses and really couldn't step forward, or they could do so only at very high risk. The legal system is a major problem, up and down the line in China. However, urban women became interested in this issue and began to reach out to their rural counterparts and try to mobilize them to step forward and speak out and name names and so on. And so this kind of tension is what prevails right on up to the present moment. No resolution is in sight.
Well, as you suggest, the gap or the distance between what's happening in the countryside in China and what's happening, say, in Shanghai and Beijing is a very striking part of your book. And certainly, Dick, there are other women in China who have a very different experience if they're in Shanghai or Beijing, especially among younger women, say in their late teens or early 20s. What is happening with respect to these other urban women in this new China of the 1990s?
What's happening in New China in the 1990s is there's enormous opportunities for people of all kinds. And the opportunities you have in the cities are somewhat different than in the countryside. But in the cities, people have opportunities nowadays, for the first time in generations, to choose their own work, to choose their own jobs, to try to work their way up ladders of corporations and small businesses and so forth. They also are exposed more than ever before to global media, the global infotainment industry, everything from Disney to Hollywood movies of all kinds and so forth. And And therefore, they're also then exposed to new standards of what a good life would be. And those standards are often set by global advertising. So among women, especially young women, they're bombarded with the kinds of magazines that young women have here. They get Cosmopolitan, and they get kind of knockoffs of Cosmopolitan, Chinese versions of it, with the same kind of pictures and the same kind
Mademoiselle
of advice.
and
Mademoiselle,
like that.
Elle, and all those kinds of magazines. So they get the international ones plus Chinese versions of them, which give you this image of a successful woman as being both successful, rich, physically attractive, sexually attractive, and all those kinds of things. And of course, that particular particular image has the same problems that it does here, maybe worse than in China. And it's very difficult to put them all together in a really effective way. So in many ways, it opens people up to frustration when they can't have it all. But at the same time, it lifts their desires and their aspirations. We have a chapter in this book about such magazines and the kind of images of an ideal womanhood that they purvey.
Now, China, apparently from your book, China remains, as you point out, Paul, a very patriarchal society. I mean, that was true under communism, it's true under the present regime. But it does appear as though women are going to be able to have stronger negotiating positions, maybe, especially in the cities than ever before. Is that the case in terms of their ability to have some degree of autonomy with respect to male and female relationships?
Well, I was beginning to touch on that a moment ago when I talked about urban women, professional women of the sort that Dick just described, who sense that they're fully modern and they want to plug into the international world, and then they listen. They have internet access, and they have foreign friends, and they know something about international standards, for example, about gender equality. And they worry that their rural sisters don't have any of that information, and so they become a lobby. And this, of course, raises the whole issue of civil society and what kinds of organizations can flourish in a place like China, independent of the government. And so most of the information, in fact, that I got about the domestic violence issue in the rural sector was provided by urban women who have put together a publication, partly funded by the Ford Foundation, in which they are bringing together a kind of lobbying force where they're putting pressure on the government and saying, we have to provide rural women with information about their rights. I mean, there are laws. It's against the law to commit rape. It's against the law to arrange marriages, to force your daughter into a marriage. And women need to be told that they have these rights, and also the legal institutions need to be there when they do step forward. So you have urban women very, very frustrated about this gap between the urban and the rural sector. They are stepping forward. They are beginning to function like a lobby. Of course, there are dangers to that. They know the limits, and they're constantly trying to push the limits out. But it's very dynamic, and it changes. It seems by the week and by the month. But they sometimes also, because I think they're plugged into international networks, they sometimes want to go even beyond what the law provides for. The law says murder, rape, arranging marriages is illegal and can and should be prosecuted. They want those laws enforced. But then they push for areas where the law either doesn't exist or it's vague. For example, two issues that came up time and again in the materials I looked at were the issue, on the one hand, of sexual harassment. The concept is relatively unknown in China, certainly in the rural sector. The idea that it's not okay to harass women in the rural setting. So the urban women are saying, we need laws about this. We need to have protections, otherwise the women are going to be harassed. The other issue that came up over and over again with tensions in marriages and so forth is the issue of is there such a thing as rape within marriage, within the institution of marriage? And again, in rural China, I mean, this concept was unknown. But the urban women, many of them sort of do-gooder types organized into these different groups who want to spread the word. They have kind of missionary zeal about new standards that need to be developed. They're telling the rural women through their publications and through people who go out into the rural areas to try to mobilize women that, yes, there is such a thing as rape within marriage. You do have rights, and we need laws. And so they're lobbying for not only the enforcement of existing laws, but also for new laws.
Dick, you wrote a very striking piece in the volume about the long history of beggary in China, which apparently, as you perceive it, has not only a long history, but it's actually a kind of a profession or a continuing form of social behavior that goes back maybe 1,000 years or more. Can you tell us a little bit about how beggary has changed, say, from the socialist period into this new market-driven China?
That particular article, which I wrote together with a person who had been a visiting scholar here, Leila Fernandez Stembridge, who's now at the University of Madrid in Spain, was about these beggars, and partly was in the context of this vast migration that's taking place in China. You know, there may be 200 million people on the road now going to cities in search of work. And this migration, look at it from afar, it looks like it's kind of chaotic, but it really isn't. It's structured by various kinds of rules, informal or formal. The kind of rules that structure it aren't necessarily the rules that are enshrined in a rule of law, but are enshrined in custom and tradition and so forth. So what you see in China is this very paradoxical situation of a country that's modernizing in some respects very rapidly, but the traditional hasn't gone away, the pre-modern hasn't gone away. In some respects, the modernization process brings into being or revives certain kind of very traditional traditions, practices. And begging is a good example because many of the beggars are following practices and customs and appealing to systems of meaning that go back, as you say, hundreds, indeed thousands of years. And begging was seen as a profession. It was seen as a place within kind of an overall moral order. People who want to demonstrate their merit and gain the kind of merit that would lead them to be reincarnated in the good afterlife would do so by giving out alms to beggars, and they fit into the system in kind of a natural way. Also were organized in terms of beggar groups with heads and association and then with connections with the government and so forth. And you see this happening again in China. Many of the beggars are not just loners who have fallen through the cracks of the system. They've come and they've revived traditions of begging, and they belong to beggar groups, and they pay a little bit of money to the beggar boss, who then kind of helps give them protection and also carries out the work of assigning beggars to choice positions, and so they don't compete with each other and so forth, and handles whatever it takes to make sure the police stay off their backs, allow them to do their begging and so forth. So there's an organized kind of thing that follows very traditional patterns. At the same time, the processes of change are also creating another kind of beggars, maybe more, the kind that we're more familiar with here with our homeless here in the United States. People who have fallen through the cracks, who are therefore more alone and wild and aggressive in some respects. And these two aspects of being a beggar are colliding. And sometimes, perhaps, you get the worst of both worlds, usually not the best. And so there's a kind of a mean edge to this status of being a beggar now that it wasn't before, even as it still reproduces some very traditional patterns.
Well, an overwhelming theme of your book is the tension between the desire on the part of the Chinese elite and as well as the ordinary people to sample and participate in this kind of global economy, and yet try to maintain some sense of how China is different from the rest of the world. And that plays out very significantly in the way in which basketball has become, even in some sense, as important as soccer in terms of sporting activity in China. Can you tell me about the tensions between, say, the world of the NBA and the world of Chinese basketball?
Well, it's a great example. I mean, to all of us, when we think about the NBA, we know what we're talking about in the American context. We know how it fits in. And then when we hear that the NBA and its life is phenomenally popular in China, it seems to require explanation. In fact, Kobe Bryant's picture is on the cover of this book. This is probably the only book, I'm sure it's the only book on China that has a picture of Kobe Bryant on the cover. And we get asked all the time, what's Kobe Bryant's picture doing on the cover? And I think the reason for that happens to be a poster that was photographed in Beijing, a huge poster with Kobe's face, and he's selling some kind of product, and there's a soldier walking by in full uniform casting a shadow over this image, and we thought that nicely summed up the whole theme of the book. But the fact is the NBA does, I think like McDonald's, like Starbucks, the NBA does mean something different in China. It's not what it means here, and that's what's so interesting about China these days. In this particular chapter of the book, we focus on the slam dunk as something which has really captivated the imagination of certainly urban and surprising numbers of rural Chinese who know the statistics of the NBA, and they know Dennis Rodman, and they know Michael Jordan, and they know Kobe really, really well. And I think the context that we need to have to understand this phenomenon is to think a little bit about what basketball, or any sport for that matter, was like in Maoist China, in socialist China. And there, of course, it was all about the team. It was all about team effort. In fact, the players didn't even have their names on the back of their shirts. It was always number 5, number 7. And I remember years ago listening to sports broadcasts in China. You'd listen to a basketball game, and it was always, you know, number 7 passes the ball to number 10, and number 10 passes the ball over to number 2. Number 3 scores, you know, on a jump shot. You didn't know who these people were. And it was all about the team concept. And I think the Soviet Union had that reputation, too, in the way they played hockey and so forth. And when they did away with this whole system in the economic realm, I think what people don't completely understand yet is it was also done away with in very significant degrees in the cultural realm as well. And it's like, you know, the pendulum swinging. When it swings high and hard. And so it went from this sort of no individual identity team Maoist concept during the high socialist era all the way over to, you know, the worm, you know, Dennis Rodman, and ultra individualism with flair and flash and style and so forth. And so almost a cult-like following for these people began to arise in China. And it got summed up in the act of the slam dunk. I mean, the slam dunk, this ability literally, I mean, they talked about Michael Jordan was known as the flyer. He seemed to be flying. To them, he was flying. He'd leave the ground at somewhere around the foul line and then dunk the ball. And there was something about this individual act that resonated with this sort of entrepreneurial spirit that we've talked about in the economic realm, or for that matter, the kinds of things Dick was talking about in the fashion magazines. The glamour, the assertion of individual identity, the ability to fly when that doesn't seem to be possible for mortal humans, to slam dunk that ball. It was a rejection, really, of the way that sports and indeed society was organized a while ago.
Well, let me ask you both a very big question, and that is, back in the 1980s, the Soviet Union under Mr. Gorbachev attempted glasnost and perestroika to open up the Soviet Union to the winds of economic and political change. And China seems to have been going through much of this same process now. Do you think that the same fate with respect to the Communist Party will befall China as it attempts to make this sort of transition to a more market economy? Will China suffer the same fate as the Soviet Union in the 1980s?
I think we don't know. It's almost impossible to predict the future. Someone named Gordon Chang has just written a book called The Coming Collapse of China, and he predicts that within 5 years, 5 to 10 years, the whole society will collapse. And I believe that that indeed could happen. There's enough forces, centrifugal forces, stress and strain caused by all this, which will be intensified as China enters the World Trade Organization, to make that happen. But I also think that it probably won't. You know, I could see why it would, but there are other ways, things of keeping it together. I think what you can see, though, is enormous strain and stress, some things that are very wonderful for people, but also very ugly things happening, because the government's going to have to step up repression, I think, to kind of keep people whose aspirations have risen in line, especially after they get disappointed by being exposed to all the pressures of the world market economy. So there'll be human rights problems, moral dilemmas, and it's going to be a grand, dramatic process in the next 10 years.
What do you think?
Well, I agree with Dick in the sense that many predictions have been made in the past, and it's remarkable from the 1950s on how often the experts were wrong in the predictions, or how often it was the case that experts failed to see what was coming, and I think we're firmly in that camp. We don't know what's going to happen. What the book tries to deal with is all of these stresses and strains. China is trying to sort out, you know, what modernity means for all of its different kinds of people, you know, in this day and age. There are many, many problems with the legal system, with the Chinese Communist Party, very repressive, human rights problems, everything that we've talked about here. On the other hand, we tend to be, of course, very sympathetic with people who feel the weight of that repression. And sometimes it blinds us to the rather remarkable ability of the Chinese Communist Party to reinvent itself on an ongoing basis. And so if you look at the people at the summit of that party now, all of whom are going to leave the scene probably in the next 6 to 12 months, the president, the premier of the state council, and so forth, to give way to yet another generation. But if you look just at the people who are in power now and compare them to the people who were in power during the Mao era, or to even Deng Xiaoping and his people who were known as reformers, it's remarkable, how different they are and how quickly they're trying to adjust. They know exactly what happened in the Soviet Union, and they don't want that to happen in China. Their argument is we've learned that lesson, and we'll do what it takes. Part of that will be highly repressive. We've seen from the Tiananmen incident that they're perfectly capable of bringing out armed forces to take care of these problems. And on the other hand, they adapt. They're willing to adapt.
I want to thank you both, Paul Pickowitz from the Department of History, Dick Madsen from the Sociology Department, for joining us tonight. The title of the new book is Popular China, Unofficial Culture in a Globalizing Society. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you very much.
Next on UCSD Conversations, UCSD Arts Bridge scholars extend arts education to area public schools.
ArtsBridge first started in UC Irvine, and it's a program where they take students who major in the arts, be it visual arts, theater, dance, music, and they take them into the community to work with students in the public school system who aren't exposed to arts, who don't get a chance to, either every day or at all, get a chance to work in the arts and to kind of see what they're about.
My specific project that I'm working on with Amir is a theater project. It's basically all of our students are 8th graders. We have about 30 8th graders, and they're all, this is their first time working with drama and theater arts, and so our goal is to introduce theater to the students and make it accessible to them, so they don't think that it's something that only the people on TV get to do, that they can really use it and feel like they can read plays and feel like they can go to the theater and it applies to their life. So our basic goal when we started working with the students was to get the students to start thinking about character development and how they can develop their own characters and use their own personality to create these new characters.
Well, it's being integrated in the projects that they're doing. It's taking it from simply writing and getting a grade and putting it in their portfolios to, hey, they're going to write it, they're going to think about it more, they're going to do it in a different way so that they can see that learning doesn't always have to be the same way every single time.
Right now, we just want to get them comfortable enough where they can write a short play in a group and then perform it, be it from a historical aspect or from basically any other aspect they want to, but to be able to sit down and write a play and feel comfortable and confident enough to go out and perform it for their peers, for their teachers, for their parents.
We really wanted to get these students excited about theater and excited about performance. And so our goal was just to introduce it and introduce theater and give them the foundations that we felt they needed. Like, what is a character? What are the different parts of the stage? What goes into creating a character? What goes into making a play? What is dialogue? The basics, really foundations. And from there, we slowly, without them even knowing it, we kind of tweak it and complicated it so that pretty soon they're making their own plays.
This is just a gradual process from working without script, getting more acting-wise, and then kind of involving the writing as well, and then the performance.
Yeah! Every day in our class, we start out with a warm-up, and we try to show the students how important a warm-up is. We do vocal warm-up and a physical warm-up, and we incorporate theater games, different ways to just get, what I told them is, like, every day we're going to have little mini performances. So we'll usually stand in a circle and every student comes forward and makes a sound and movement, getting their bodies warmed up, getting their voices warmed up. And that little moment, they're performing, whether or not they really think of it as a performance.
And then from that point on, we'll go on to a little more difficult exercise, like something like freeze tag.
No, I'm walking much better.
Freeze? Someone else come in? So that kind of gets them creatively working and kind of gets them used to performing and being on stage in front of their peers.
Every exercise is building on the next exercise. So we get them warmed up, we get them everybody moving so everybody participates. So even the students who maybe in other classes can kind of sit back and, you know, they're shy and they don't want to participate, we get them involved and we get everybody working together.
Usually I was like real shy before, like, I mean, I was just sit there like, I'm not doing this, but now, I mean, Amir and Bethany have helped out a lot and like just showing us how to do it, I guess.
I wanted to get all the kids involved. That was my main goal, was to loosen up the class, to get them to feel comfortable with each other. And my main goal is to show them that books aren't just about the words on the page.
If you want to learn how to think on your feet, you know, put somebody in front of 30 people and say, go, you know, and you know, of course it's a little scary. And so, I mean, of course that's not what we started with. We've progressed to that.
It's getting me comfortable because like in our other classes we're doing like we're doing drama too, like with our history and in our reading classes and stuff like that, and like I'm becoming more like able to like, it's easier for me to like to come up with the idea because like we do it a lot with Amir and Bethany and stuff like that, so it's easier for me to come up with something like short and good and stuff like that.
And just with these 3 lines we had completely different situations, okay?
Since the students know that we're students right now, that we're college students, I hope that they see us as kind of role models, kind of mentors, that they can ask us questions. You know, sometimes they'll ask us questions about college classes or about our performances. And I know they've said, oh, tell us when you're performing so we can come see you. And I mean, I think that's fun because then I think college becomes more accessible for them.
And we'll say stop, and we'll give you an emotion, and then we'll clap and you hit a pose with that emotion, okay? Well, my role in the project is to help the kids be exposed to the arts. And in the way, if I can teach them about the arts, something that they remember, that would be great. When the kids know that this is not just some guy who just wants to come and teach theater, but that actually he's involved with it, and after college he will be involved with it for the rest of his life, that helps a lot because they respect you more and they know that you're serious about your craft and that you're not just kind of just coming in, just preaching to them.
I think that the classroom teacher is so important in the process, in the ArtsBridge process, because the teacher knows the students. The teacher works with the students every day. And so it was really important for us to meet with the teacher beforehand and let him just talk to us about his students and kind of give us an idea of where they're at and, you know, what students, what they've been working on and what the growth he's seen since he's had them.
There's always supposed to be a teacher involved and in the room at all times. In that way, I'm also able to help the teachers learn about different ways to approach the arts with their kids, so that once we leave, they would be able to teach their kids just about the arts in general, so that they get something from it as well.
I'm getting a lot of interaction with students that I didn't think were going to participate. They're really starting to step forward, which I'm a little interested to see, you know, their reactions to them. When you're in a classroom, normally they're very quiet and timid, and all of a sudden they're on stage and they're a whole different person.
I think that it's great to collaborate in the process because we definitely want to work with the teacher so that the teacher can feel like the work that they're doing outside is supported by the ArtsBridge program. And so kind of bringing those two together.
I've seen their comprehension increase, but I've also just emotionally seen them increase their understanding of people in books and in writing. There's a more connection because now they're seeing, hey, those aren't just people in a book, they're actual real people, or they're people that the character or the author really wanted to present in a certain way. So they're getting different perspectives.
When we're reading and we're supposed to like get the emotions of people, I feel like I can understand what they're feeling and what they're going through because of this.
Just help me out.
We'll probably be working on this character work with the scenes for the next week or two, just so they can actually grasp the idea of getting into a group and working together as a team to come up with a scene all together and involving everyone and really being clear on their objectives. It's actually a lot to ask for an 8th grader to do.
I like working in groups because it's funner, because like people, like you'll have an idea and if somebody else has a better idea, you know, you kind of like, oh yeah, that works better.
From any other classes, like you go in, you sit down, you do your work, and then like you talk, you get in trouble, and then like whatever, and like you just stay in there for like the 45 minutes or whatever, and then you go to the next class. But in here, you get to act out, you get to be yourself and stuff like that, and like you just get to express your feelings like in like your little acts or something.
My personal goals are just, I think that every time I see the students getting excited about the arts, it just reinforces my passion for it. I definitely want to continue working in the schools because it's definitely been an opportunity for me to kind of remember why I'm studying theater, why I'm studying dance, because it's exciting, because it applies to your life, because it's a wonderful release, because it's something new and it's challenging every time you do it. Every time you do it, you learn something new.
It opened my eyes to teaching as well, because I always thought, I'm going to be an actor, I'm just going to work in the stage and TV and try to get jobs. But now I'm thinking I actually might want to go to grad school and get an MFA degree and then actually go and teach. Because it's another aspect of happiness that you get, fulfillment, teaching, bringing your art that you enjoy to do to other kids who haven't been exposed to it and getting them to kind of enjoy it and become interested in it. It's a whole nother fulfillment. Karate instructor. Getting the teacher involved and making sure that he or she is in the classroom and involved with the students kind of goes beyond that. It helps this teacher as well know how to work with the students in the arts so that once we're gone, it can continue. It doesn't just stop there. The students will still be exposed once in a while with the teacher's knowledge to the arts.
I think that we wanted the students to be able to, we want them to understand kind of how the arts can fit into their life. I mean, ideally every school would have an arts program that gets adequate funding, that has teachers who really care about the arts. I mean, that's ideal. But since a lot of the schools don't have those type of programs, or a lot of the funding has been cut for that, I think that it's a really unique opportunity for older students who really care about the arts and who have been able to study the arts to come in and create a space where the art still lives. The arts are still alive, are still there for the students to access.
I just think that this is one of the aspects that all kids need. All kids at all grade levels working together, learning different things about the arts. It's a fantastic way of learning, and it's one that all kids should have an opportunity to have. So I just appreciate having them come in.
I actually was shocked about how little the arts are focused on in the school curriculum. Just starting in elementary school. I mean, starting from first grade on through 8th grade, all the general subjects are always covered, but the arts are somehow just completely left out. And sometimes it's great just to see the faces of the kids, just being exposed to arts and just kind of singing or dancing or acting or just being exposed to them. It lights up their eyes, and it's a great experience because it's just something that they need and they're lacking, and just to provide it to them, they just are just so happy to get it.
Whether or not you choose to go audition for the play at your school play, the point is, at some point, the arts can help you in ways that we can't even imagine.
Ta-da!
Finally tonight, Dr. Mark Tushinsky discusses recent work involving neural regeneration.
Dr. Tushinsky, thanks for inviting us to your lab today.
It's a pleasure.
I understand that you're doing a number of interesting projects concerning nervous system regeneration and degeneration.
That's right. We're interested in how aging affects the brain and how we can influence cell death in the context of disease of the brain. And we also work on spinal cord injury and trying to reestablish connections between injured parts of the nervous system. So we look at aging, and we look at cell death, and we look at what's called axon regeneration after spinal cord injury.
What's the major tools that you use?
Well, there are many tools for studying these sorts of questions. Our favorites in the laboratory here are to look at a family of substances called nervous system growth factors. These growth factors are proteins. They're naturally present in the brain and the spinal cord. During fetal development, these proteins play important roles in helping cells survive and to make their appropriate connections with other cells in the nervous system. It turns out that these proteins are also present throughout our adult lives. and actually serve a function we're not entirely certain about. But that's another area of our research to understand why these growth factors are normally present. But what is abundantly clear now is that if we deliver extra amounts of these growth factors to the aging or the degenerating brain, as in Alzheimer's disease, or if we supply growth factors after trauma to the nervous system, like spinal cord injury, then we can influence cell fate, we can promote cell survival, and depending on how we do this, and if we do it just right, then we can reestablish connections after such problems as spinal cord injury.
So is the nerve growth factor actually promoting new nerve tissue growth?
These growth factors, and there are at least 50 of these different growth factors present in the nervous system, work on turning on, switching on genes and cells that influence a wide variety of cellular functions, including genes and proteins related to cell survival and cell growth and a number of other functions. So there's a lot that we still don't know about growth factors. We sort of have the empirical evidence, as it's called, though, that if we deliver the growth factor in a condition that would ordinarily cause a cell to die, it survives. And if we deliver a growth factor to a cell that has lost its connection with another cell, for example in the injured spinal cord, then we can get the axons to grow again and hopefully sometimes make appropriate connections, and hopefully sometimes that could be enough to restore function.
Growth factor is in all cells, not just nerve cells.
We are most interested in growth factors that are in nerve cells. These nervous system growth factors are only, of course, in the nervous system, and hence their name, nervous system growth factors. But there are growth factors that are present in other parts of the body that also stimulate functions of cells related to different things. So there is a different type of growth factor that stimulates the production of blood, for example. That's called erythropoietin. And that's commonly used in treating people who have blood loss or people who might go to surgery who want to boost their blood cell counts. So these growth factors have been known to exist for a while, but in fact their ability to prevent cell death, their potential to promote neural repair has really only come into its own in the last 10 or 15 years, but there is enormous potential there that could be exploited to treat nervous system diseases in ways that don't currently exist.
Can you give us an update? I understand that you're doing a clinical trial for Alzheimer's treatment.
We are doing a clinical trial delivering growth factors to the brains of people with Alzheimer's disease. And we're delivering the growth factors by using gene therapy. And why is that? Well, these growth factors are, again, they're proteins, and proteins are fairly big molecules as molecules go in nature. Many of these proteins possess a charge. And so because of their size and because of their charge, they don't cross something called the blood-brain barrier if we administer these growth factors orally or after an injection outside the brain. So the growth factors to reach the area of the brain or the spinal cord that we're interested in treating have to be directly delivered to those areas. And one way of doing that, thanks to the molecular biological revolution of the last 10 and 20 years, is gene therapy or genetic engineering. And what we do is we can genetically engineer cells to make large amounts of these growth factors. And we do that by introducing the gene for a particular growth factor of interest into a cell. And we turn that gene on. And when that gene is turned on, the cell begins to put out large quantities of the growth factor. So we can use that trick of genetic engineering to therapeutically deliver a growth factor. And we started doing that work in collaboration with others a number of years ago, and showed that that gene therapy means of delivering a growth factor can prevent cell death in the brains of rats and then in monkeys. And the particular group of cells that we could prevent the death of was also a group of cells that are lost in Alzheimer's disease. So based on that body of work that we and many other people did, we've begun a clinical trial of gene therapy delivering nerve growth factor to see if we can prevent degeneration of cells in Alzheimer's disease and, who knows, potentially for a period at least improve function. So that's a phase 1 clinical trial. It's the first clinical trial of gene therapy in Alzheimer's disease. And so far 2 people have undergone the procedure. They've done fine. They haven't had any adverse effects. We don't know yet if it's an effective therapy and probably won't know that for several years yet. but the trial is continuing. Instead of trying to compensate for cell loss after it has already occurred, the aim of this growth factor gene therapy trial is to try and prevent that cell loss in the first place. So that's a new sort of therapy that, you know, if it is effective, could be very nice and useful in developing a different type of means of trying to prevent cell loss in the brain in a variety of diseases. I mean, this first trial is in Alzheimer's, but the same sort of approach could be applied in Parkinson's disease and Huntington's disease and other brain disorders.
So it's not necessarily going to be a cure per se, but it would slow the process of the disease?
It certainly would not be a cure. And the reason it wouldn't be a cure is because there are a number of different cell types that are lost in Alzheimer's disease, and this growth factor that we're testing influences only one of those cell types. Now, the type that we hope to prevent the loss of is an important cell type. And so there's a reasonable chance that it could, in fact, improve symptoms of the disease, or at least slow the progression. But because it only influences one of several cell types, it won't be a cure. But Alzheimer's disease is so tragic a disease that to be able to slow the progression, I think, would be a valuable contribution. The National Institutes of Health have performed a number of studies that have shown that if a therapy would even delay progression of Alzheimer's disease by 6 months, you know, in a disease that has an average duration of 7 years or more, a slowing by even 6 months would have an enormous impact, not only in terms of quality of life, although that's the most important thing, but also economically.
If you could, give us sort of a brief description of how the actual procedure is done of injecting NGF into the brain.
Okay. How do we do gene therapy in patients? Well, the procedure begins with a skin biopsy. We take a very small punch of skin and we grow from that biopsy a type of cell called a fibroblast. It's the type of cell that normally makes scars, in fact, when we get injured. So it's a cell that we can readily grow in the test tube, and we can genetically engineer using what are called gene therapy vectors that introduce, in this case, the nerve growth factor gene into the cell. We can amplify those cells in the test tube into millions of cells. Then we harvest them from the test tube and implant them into the brain using a needle. So this requires surgery. But so with a actually rather simple surgical procedure, we inject those cells into the brain and the person's own skin cells. So it's not as though they're getting cells from another source. They're the person's own cells, but they have now been genetically engineered to make human nerve growth factor. So the cells are essentially miniature pumps for the production of nerve growth factor. They're set into the brain adjacent to the cells that are degenerating in Alzheimer's disease. And the hope is that by secreting the nerve growth factor, they will support the survival of these cells, which would otherwise die, and thereby prevent progression of the disease. Ultimately, this approach will only be useful if it slows progression of the disease. So the ultimate measure of effectiveness will be if people with Alzheimer's disease show a decline in intellectual function more slowly after receiving this therapy.
Similar to the Alzheimer's research that you're doing, you discovered that you could actually affect the aging process of the healthy brain.
Well, one of the questions we had is, how does aging affect the brain normally? We know that as a normal consequence of aging, there's some decline in cognitive abilities, as we say, in some forms of memory, some forms of thinking and action that require complex tasks. And why, as a function of aging, we lose some of those functions isn't entirely clear. Now, it used to be thought for many years that, well, there was death of cells in the brain as a function of aging, and that's why some functions decline. But in fact, that turns out not to be true. There is very little cell death in the brain as a function of aging. And that's so important that I'll repeat it. There is very little cell death in the brain as a function of aging. And in a way, that's good news, because that means, well, if the cells aren't dead, they're still there, and maybe we can do something to reactivate them, to stimulate their function. And so in one series of studies that we've talked about before, we used growth factors, again using gene therapy in aged monkeys, and showed that with aging in monkeys, cells become shrunken and less functional, less active. And following growth factor gene therapy, we could restore the size and the function of the cells to their previous state. That's all measured in brain sections. What we didn't know was whether that had any effect on the intellectual function, on the memory performance and that sort of thing in the aged monkeys. And so those are studies that we are doing now. And maybe the next time we speak, I can give you some information about whether this growth factor gene therapy approach can in fact influence not just Alzheimer's disease, but the process of normal aging. Many of our studies have focused on this first growth factor to be identified called nerve growth factor, but we're also looking at other growth factors in aged, well, in the process of normal aging and in fact in aged monkeys. And some of these other growth factors may exert some interesting actions that could really broaden the tools with which we can attack the problem of aging. And sort of on a philosophical note, I'll just say that, our interest is not in extending life, but in improving the quality of life. It probably wouldn't be a good thing for the planet or humanity if a number of us lived much longer than we do now. But if we could improve the quality of the lives that we have with our current lifespan, that would be a useful contribution. So that's more the focus of our work.
Where are you today with your spinal cord injury research?
Yeah, well, the problem of spinal cord regeneration is different than trying to prevent cell death and looking at aging, because in the case of spinal cord injury, it's actually quite a bit more complex. In the case of spinal cord injury, a cable, essentially, that contains 1 to 2 million wires is cut. And there's a need to restore those wires, to have them regrow, find their correct targets that can be feet away from the site of the injury, and choose the correct target out of potentially millions of possibilities. So it's a complex problem. And that's, well, in a way, that's the bad news. The good news is, though, that even if you get these connections called axons to start to regrow in the injured spinal cord, and even if they don't form the correct connections, the brain is what's called plastic. It can accommodate an incorrect connection and still generate some useful function out of it, or at least that's what seems to be the case. So we are trying to get the axons to grow again, and we're doing that by delivering the growth factors, again using gene therapy, to elicit the new growth of these axons. And axons, if they are provided with a growth factor after a spinal cord injury, do exhibit a robust ability to regrow. And we can readily get them to grow into the lesion site. What we are trying to do now is to control the growth factor delivery in a way where we can turn it off at a certain time so the axons leave the first spot to which they have grown and now grow to another spot where we subsequently turn growth factors on again, so that we pull the axons along into and hopefully beyond the injury site to get them to grow to the parts of the spinal cord that have lost their connections. So that work is moving along. It's being led by somebody named Dr. Blesch in our neural repair group. And it's very interesting. Even 5 years ago, the technology didn't exist to do this sort of work, and now it does. And there is a realistic possibility that using these advances in molecular biology and gene therapy and our knowledge of growth factors, that there is a possibility that this could be useful in getting axons to actually bridge across the site of injury and, who knows, perhaps restore function. We hope so.
I'm not really sure if I understood how you were trying to draw the growth factor to the other axons. Is that, as opposed to re-injecting in a different location or something like that, you're trying to get the body to do it naturally?
Yeah,
in the
yeah.
natural healing process?
Yeah, a little hard to explain. In a spinal cord injury, you can say that there are two obstacles that we need to overcome. One is to get the axons to grow into where the injury actually occurred. And that's step one of the process. And there's been pretty good success based on work from laboratories around the world. And now there's much more optimism that we can get an injured connection to regrow than we thought possible even 10 years ago. That's step one of the process, to get the axons to grow into the site that was injured. But step two of this process is to get the axons to grow beyond that, to reform the connections with the distant parts of the spinal cord that have been disconnected from their original targets. And that's another type of a challenge. We can get the axons to get through step one, to grow into the injury site by putting growth factors in there, and the axons will grow and extend into the lesion site in response to the growth factors. But now we need to get them out again, to get them beyond that. And one way we can do that through recent advances in gene therapy technology is to turn the genes on and off, to have the gene on at the site of injury, the growth factor gene on at the site of injury, to bring the injured connections in. But then we need to turn it off at that site of injury so the connections have some reason to leave that injury site again.
Right.
If you don't turn it off on the injury site, they may never leave because they're attracted toward the growth factor. And unless you give them some other reason to grow beyond that injury site, they may not do so. So again, what we can do with advances in gene therapy technology is get them into the injury site by turning on the growth factor gene there, then turn that growth factor gene off in the injury site and have them, and turn another growth factor gene on beyond the injury site, so the axons now grow toward that second source. That work is led by Dr. Armand Blesch in the laboratory, and there's not an unrealistic chance that that experimental strategy may be useful, at least in rats, in the first set of studies.
That's fantastic. So it's sort of like pruning a bush.
That's right.
Prune it back so it'll grow.
Injured connections in the brain and spinal cord are like cutting the branches of a bush. When you cut the limbs of a tree, then new sprouts form. And that also happens in the brain and the spinal cord when you cut a connection. But they don't do anything more than that. They just sprout a little bit and then they stop. But if we give them the growth factor, then they'll grow for a longer distance. They can begin to reform that limb. And other people in other laboratories around the world use other approaches to get those connections to grow. So there are different ways of attacking the problem. Growth factors is one of them, but
so conceivably, if it were to ever become an actual treatment for spinal cord injury, it'd probably be a mixture of many different approaches.
Yep, the greatest probability of success in spinal cord injury will be to combine approaches. Growth factors, neutralizing things that block growth in the spinal cord, finding other proteins that are normally present that make a scaffold to which an injured connection can attach and grow along. It's a multifaceted problem that most creatively will require several different approaches.
You got a lot of work to do, obviously. What do you see happening? I mean, what would you like to be doing in the future? Where do you see yourself in 5 years?
Well, ideally in 5 years, we'll have had some indication from our clinical trial that delivering growth factors will be useful in preventing or reducing cell loss in an actual disease. And then we'll focus on other growth factors targeting other types of cells to amplify that process of cell rescue. We'd like to have more insight into how aging affects the brain and be able to intervene in specific aspects of cell function that decline with aging to try and rev up that process again, so cells function better even into aging. And finally, in the spinal cord injury field, we hope that these means of turning genes on and off and delivering different growth factors and combining it with other approaches may eventually have a useful functional outcome that we could even dare to speculate that we might try to apply in humans with injury one day.